It's the night of April 6th, 1812, outside a Spanish fortress city called Badajoz, and in the forward trench a few dozen British soldiers are waiting in the dark to do the worst job in the world. The job has a name: the Forlorn Hope. These are the men who go into the breach first. Straight at the gap the cannons have smashed in the wall ahead of the entire army into a space the defenders have spent weeks preparing to kill people in. The name sounds poetic. It isn't. It's a Dutch phrase, verloren hoop, the lost troop, that English soldiers mangled into something prettier. The Dutch version is more honest. These men are not expected to come back. Here's the strange part. Nobody was ordered into that trench. Every man in the Forlorn Hope volunteered, and there were more volunteers than places. The 2 bugler slots had to be settled by drawing lots. And another bugler, a man who had already survived a forlorn hope 3 months earlier, who knew exactly what a breach does to the men who reach it first, went to the bugle major and offered him $2 to buy his way into the winner's place. The winner, a young bugler named William Green, wouldn't sell. His words,
"I shall go where my duty calls me."
A man who had seen the breach tried to pay to see it again. Armies have had this problem for as long as there have been walls. Someone has to go first, and the man who goes first usually dies. Yet the ladders keep going up, and men keep climbing them, which means armies, wherever you look in the record, have been running some version of the same hidden machine, one that gets an ordinary, sensible, frightened man to walk toward death on purpose. This is the story of that machine. It runs through a gold crown that 2 soldiers nearly started a mutiny over, through a Roman general who killed 50 of his own men by lottery, and through the most famous statistic in military psychology, the one armies spent half a century believing, and which was almost certainly invented. It starts with the obvious answer: pay. The job had a price list. For the officer who led a forlorn hope and lived, the reward, by custom, was promotion, a step up in rank that other men waited half a career or paid a fortune for. For a sergeant, a commission, a chance to cross the one line the army's whole class system was built on and die a gentleman. That's the machine's first gear, and it's simple. Make the prize for surviving enormous and let the odds do the rest. Except that gear can't explain who was actually in the trench. Most of the men in a forlorn hope were privates, and for a private, the army offered almost nothing. No bonus, no promotion. Some regiments let survivors stitch a laurel wreath badge onto one sleeve. One of them, the 52nd, eventually struck a proper medal for its stormers. In 1820, 8 years after Badajoz, when somebody finally got around to it. That was the package. A piece of embroidery, a medal you might live to collect a decade late, and a very good chance of dying before breakfast. The privates volunteered anyway. They drew lots. They offered bribes. Even for officers, the promise wasn't a contract. The lieutenant who had led the Forlorn Hope at the previous siege, that same winter, shot in the head at the breach, kept going, personally took the enemy governor's sword, spent years afterward complaining that his promised promotion never came. The rewards, in other words, sometimes didn't arrive at all. Men kept volunteering anyway. That night at Badajoz, the columns attacking the breaches were thrown back about 40 times in 2 hours. Some 2,000 men fell in a space the size of a few city streets, and the survivors' memoirs, written years later, don't read like the accounts of men who were tricked. They read like men describing the proudest night of their lives. So money explains the shape of this machine. It can't explain the pressure inside it. Something else was doing the real work. And to see it, you have to go back 2,000 years to the people who ran this system longer and more deliberately than anyone else we know of. You have to watch Rome hand out a crown. Rome kept a specific prize for the exact job we've been talking about, the first man over an enemy wall. It was called the mural crown, a circlet of gold worked into the shape of a wall with turrets. The gold was the least of it. What mattered was the staging. A Greek historian named Polybius, who spent years attached to the Roman army, describes the ceremony. After an assault, the general gathered the entire army. Tens of thousands of men formed up in ranks. Then, in front of all of them, he called out by name the men who had fought best and set the gold crown on the head of the first man who had mounted the wall. The ceremony in camp was only half of it. The other half waited at home. Polybius is explicit. Back in Rome, only decorated men were permitted to wear their decorations in the city's religious processions. Once a year, in front of the whole city, courage was made visible. Your neighbors could see it. Your rivals could see it. Anyone who might ever marry your daughter could see it. Polybius even tells us why the system existed in plain terms. It was built, he wrote, to excite rivalry, not only in the men standing in those ranks, but in the ones who had stayed at home. Rome wasn't paying men to be brave. Rome was staging bravery in front of the largest audience it could assemble and letting men compete for the viewing rights. And compete they did. In 209 BC, at the storming of a city in Spain, a centurion and a marine each claimed to have topped the wall first. The argument spread through the whole force, legion against fleet, until the general found himself closer to a mutiny over a crown than he had ever come to losing the battle. He handled it the way Rome handled a disputed claim. He appointed arbitrators and heard witnesses as if a ladder were a lawsuit. Then he gave up, declared a tie, and awarded 2 crowns. 2 men, and behind them 2 entire services, ready to tear the camp apart over which of them had been first up a ladder. That's the detail that changes the question. Courage isn't a possession, it's a performance. It only exists if someone sees it, which means the real engine was never the reward. It's the audience, but the same audience that watched you crowned watched other things too. Polybius describes a second ceremony, staged in front of the same assembled army. A soldier who had slept on watch or run or thrown away his shield was led out in front of everyone. A tribune stepped forward and touched him, just touched him, with a wooden club. The touch was the entire sentence. What followed was that every man in the camp fell on him with clubs and stones and, in most cases, beat him to death where he stood. His comrades did this, the men he ate with. And Polybius adds the detail that tells you what the machine was really made of. The few who survived the beating weren't allowed to go home, ever. No family, he writes, would dare take such a man into the house. Be seen brave, and you wore gold in front of the city. Be seen a coward, and you were erased, first from the army, then from your own family's doorway. A century and a half later, a Roman general took this logic to its coldest endpoint. His legions had broken and run from Spartacus's slave army. So the general, a man named Crassus, the richest man in Rome, took 500 of the soldiers who had fled first and divided them into groups of 10. Each group drew lots, and 1 man in every 10 was beaten to death by the other 9, while the whole army stood and watched. 50 men, killed by their own friends. Plutarch, who recorded it, says even the Romans found it unsettling, an ancient punishment hauled back out of a darker past. Did it work? The sources hint the army came to fear Crassus more than the enemy, and Crassus did win his war. But we can't prove the arithmetic. And honestly, the arithmetic isn't the point. Look at who held the clubs. Not an executioner. The other 9 men of his own group. Whatever else the lottery did, every survivor now knew, through his own hands, exactly what the group could do to him. For the next 18 centuries, the pattern barely moved. Reward in public, punish in public, and let the group hold the club. Then armies grew to the size of nations, and one country, without quite meaning to, built the purest version of it ever tested. It recruited whole towns. In the summer of 1914, Britain had a small professional army and needed an enormous one immediately. The recruiting insight that solved it arrived within weeks. Men would join up, one general observed, if they were assured they'd serve with their friends. A politician put it to a Liverpool crowd out loud. This should be a battalion of pals, friends from the same office, fighting shoulder to shoulder for the honour of Britain and the credit of Liverpool. It worked beyond anyone's dreams. Offices enlisted together, so did football clubs, and in the mill towns, whole streets. A small Lancashire mill town called Accrington raised its own battalion. Clerks, weavers, brothers, neighbours, and the town knew every face in it. Nobody in charge described what they had actually built, and they may not have seen it. They had rebuilt the Roman assembly. Every man would now go to war in front of the precise audience whose opinion had governed his whole life. The men he worked beside, his own brothers among them, the audience wasn't waiting at home anymore. The audience was in the trench beside you. Remember the question from Badajoz: what actually gets a man up the ladder? On the morning of July 1st, 1916, outside a French village called Serres, that question was put to a whole town at once. At 7:30, the whistles blew, and roughly 720 men of the Accrington Pals climbed out of their trenches and walked forward into machine gun fire. 20 minutes later, 585 of them were dead or wounded. No account of that morning describes the Pals hanging back. They kept walking, because the men watching them walk were the men they had grown up with. A private in the Leeds Pals, a few miles up the same line that same morning, said it in one sentence:
We were 2 years in the making and 10 minutes in the destroying.
And then the design revealed its other edge. Because one town's men had served together, one town absorbed the whole catastrophe in a single morning. A man from Accrington remembered it simply: the day the news came through that the Pals had been wiped out. The machine had never run stronger than it ran that morning, so you'd expect what came next, armies concluding they could trust it completely. Instead, the 20th century did something stranger. It stopped trusting the machine and reached for the gun. Britain, in that same war, sentenced more than 3,000 of its own soldiers to death for desertion and cowardice. 9 out of 10 were spared. The rest, 306 men, were tied to posts at dawn and shot by their own side. It took 90 years for their government to pardon them. But the fullest test of fear as a fuel came a generation later on the Volga. In the summer of 1942, with the German army driving on Stalingrad, Stalin issued Order Number 227. Soviet soldiers knew it by its refrain: not one step back. It created punishment battalions for men who retreated, and it stationed armed blocking detachments behind wavering divisions with written authority to shoot and the order's own word. Masters and bows, mastrigmongers and cowards on the spot. That's the version the movies remember: machine guns pointed at your own infantry. The archive remembers something more interesting. In the 10 most desperate weeks at Stalingrad, those detachments stopped over 15,000 men running from the front. Of them, they shot 278. The rest, 19 men out of every 20, were turned around and walked back to their units. Not to prison, not to a penal company. Back to their own squad to stand next to the same men they'd run from. That ratio is the strangest fact in this whole story. The most ruthless coercion system ever bolted onto an army, run by a state that did not blink at killing its own citizens. And when it caught a man running, what it actually did, 95 times in 100, was return him to the men who knew him. Because somewhere inside that machinery, someone understood what Rome had understood, and what the Pals had just proved at unbearable cost. The thing that turns a running man around isn't the gun behind him. It's the squad in front of him. After the Second World War, the man who had served as the US Army's official combat historian announced a discovery that seemed to explain everything. based, he said, on hundreds of interviews with infantry companies fresh from battle. He reported that in combat, at best, 1 man in 4 ever fired his weapon at the enemy. The rest, trained men under fire, could not bring themselves to do it. The claim ran around the world. Armies redesigned their training because of it. It became the most famous statistic in the history of military psychology. It was almost certainly invented. Decades later, a historian went through the man's field notebooks page by page and found no trace of the data. No tallies, no survey, no count. The interviews happened. The arithmetic, apparently, never did. And yet, when the statistic collapsed, the conclusion underneath it didn't, because by then, researchers had spent a century arriving at the same place from every direction. A French officer named Ardent Dupic had written it down in the 1860s after quietly surveying his fellow officers about what battle was actually like. 4 brave men who do not know each other will not dare attack a lion. 4 less brave, but knowing each other well, sure of their reliability and consequently of mutual aid, will attack resolutely. In 1948, 2 American sociologists published a study of a harder puzzle: why German units had kept fighting to the very end of a war that was visibly lost. The answer wasn't fanaticism. Most German soldiers, they found, fought exactly as long as one thing held together: the small group of men immediately around them, the squad. When the squad disintegrated, the fighting stopped. And in 2003, Army researchers interviewed American soldiers straight out of combat in Iraq and asked simply why they fought. The most common answer, in those words, "Fighting for my buddies." A French colonel with a survey, 2 sociologists with prisoner interviews, Army researchers with a clipboard in Iraq, 130 years apart, in wars that had nothing else in common, the answer keeps coming back the same. So go back to the trench at Badajoz one last time and look at what William Green refused to sell. Not a medal, privates barely got one, not promotion, buglers didn't get those. What $2 couldn't buy was his place, witnessed, among the particular men who knew him. The machine's engineers spent 2,000 years decorating its front panel. Crowns, commissions, firing squads. The engine behind the panel never changed, so no, armies never learned how to make men fearless. As far as the record shows, nobody has. What they built instead was older and stranger, a machine that takes the one fear every human being carries, the fear of being cast out of the group, and aims it at a wall. Stage the courage, exile the cowardice, let the men beside you do the rest. The machine never made a single man brave. It made sure that when the ladder went up, he wasn't climbing it alone, and that everyone who knew him would know what he did next. Courage was never the fuel, it was the exhaust.